Imagine this. You are suddenly dropped into a harsh, entirely unforgiving Arctic landscape. You've got 2 solid feet of snow beneath you, temperatures that are just plummeting by the minute, and absolutely nothing to help you survive except for the clothes currently on your back. Well, that is exactly the anatomy of the extreme survival challenge we're unpacking in today's explainer. We're looking at 6 men, 7 days in an environment where literally every single mistake could cost a limb, or honestly much worse.
Okay, let's dive right into this, because the stakes are established the very second they arrive. They've got roughly 2 hours of daylight left, and the reality of their situation hits them hard and fast. With 0 tents, the crew is forced to rapidly carve a shelter directly out of the deep snow. It is a literal race against the setting sun, because, as the source material makes terrifyingly clear, if they are caught out in the open when darkness falls, they genuinely risk freezing to death. The margin for error here is absolute zero. Now, there is a way out. Woven throughout this entire ordeal is a really fascinating psychological motif: the ultimate bailout. See, the crew has a flare gun. At literally any point, they can just shoot it into the sky, summon an evacuation plane, and go home to a nice warm bed. But there's a massive catch. To earn that rescue, they must first shave their heads completely bald. It's such a brilliant psychological barrier. As their misery deepens, that flare gun just sits there, constantly tempting them, forcing them to weigh their sheer physical suffering against their pride.
So, to avoid pulling that trigger, the crew has to immediately address the critical hierarchy of survival needs. Step 1, create a shelter to block out that freezing wind and trap whatever little body heat they can generate. Step 2, build a fire to melt snow for drinking water and, thaw out their freezing hands. Without securing these 2 things on day 1, a multi-day challenge is just impossible. They literally have to dig into the snow and pack together like sardines just to share body warmth. And you might be wondering, why is getting that shelter up so incredibly urgent? Well, it all comes down to this terrifying number: 10. As night falls, the temperature plummets below 0. The environment becomes so hostile that just 10 minutes of exposure to the freezing Arctic wind can cause a limb to literally freeze solid. The cold out here isn't just uncomfortable, it's an active predator, and it is hunting for exposed skin. Now, what's really interesting about this timeline is how it shows survival isn't usually some big, glamorous, heroic moment. It's a grinding, miserable battle of attrition. Notice how rapidly things just deteriorate. Day 1 brings the absolute worst sleep of their lives in a freezing, cramped snow cave. Day 2 introduces wet firewood and some really scary medical issues. By day 3, their attempts to secure food completely fail. And by day 4, the mental toll is immense. Morale is absolutely tanking as the hunger and the bone-chilling cold really set in. Pretty much everything that can go wrong does go wrong. The physical danger really hits a peak on day 2. Chandler, one of the crew members, takes off his boots, and his toes have completely lost all color. They've turned this scary shade of white and pale purple. This right here is frostnip. It's the immediate precursor to irreversible frostbite. When the water from the snow freezes right next to your body, your superficial tissues actually begin to die. It's a massive, glowing red warning light from Mother Nature that they are playing a very, very dangerous game. Yet, juxtaposed right against this terrifying reality are some incredibly human and honestly kind of absurd mistakes. To save his toes from frostbite, Chandler actually has to stick his bare, freezing feet directly into the armpit of his cameraman, Darius. Meanwhile, in a totally desperate bid for warmth, someone leans way too close to the fire and literally sets their pants ablaze. And then, in a massive logistical oversight, actually scratch that, a total disaster, they realize nobody packed the poop tent. So they are left entirely exposed to the freezing wind and potentially lurking polar bears whenever nature calls. The comedy of errors is definitely funny in hindsight, but in the moment, the psychological toll is incredibly severe. As their clothes become soaked with snow from all these mishaps, the risk of deadly hypothermia just skyrockets. You can see the cold beginning to break them down mentally. We start hearing these raw confessions about how heavily that flare gun is weighing on their minds. It honestly feels like day 6 or 7 of a typical challenge. But remember, they are only on day 2.
Adding to all this mental strain is this massive, escalating tension. They only brought less than 4 days' worth of food. They absolutely have to hunt or fish for calories. Now, their camp is situated right on a frozen lake, but when they try to drill a fishing hole, they hit a totally impenetrable wall. The lake ice is over 2.5 feet thick. Their ice auger is simply way too short to pierce through to the water. So suddenly, they're entirely cut off from their only potential food source, and their physical energy is just draining incredibly fast.
And this brilliantly illustrates the crucial survival signs they had to deploy next. Using a drone, they scout the surrounding landscape looking for one very specific geographical feature: a river. See, unlike the still water of a lake, which freezes solid to immense depths, the moving, churning water of a river keeps the ice sheet significantly thinner. If they can just find a river, they actually have a fighting chance at piercing the ice and reaching the fish down below.
But, of course, finding a river on a tiny drone screen is very different from actually trekking there in person. What follows is this harrowing, intensely physical hike straight through an active blizzard. Their cross-country skis prove utterly useless, which forces them to trudge through a dense forest in snowshoes. Along the way, they spot these massive, super fresh moose tracks, a really quick reminder that they are absolutely not the top of the food chain out here. And worst of all, slipping by the river fills their boots with snow, immediately freezing their feet and bringing right back the very real threat of frostnip.
Which brings us to the absolute climax of the entire ordeal on day 5. They are down to their very last snack, literally a single beef stick. And to make matters infinitely worse, the fierce blizzard has officially grounded the daily rescue plane. So even if they completely broke down, wanted to shoot the flare and shave their heads, they can't. There's no rescue coming. They must secure calories today, or the wet, freezing conditions will inevitably lead to severe hypothermia and the total failure of the challenge.
The mental pressure in this specific moment is just off the charts. For the host, Jimmy, there's this overarching, intense drive for redemption. You see, in a previous survival attempt, the crew actually failed and had to tap out. The specter of that past failure is clearly haunting him. Driven by pure, stubborn willpower and an absolute refusal to be defeated by the elements again, he commits to sitting on that ice for literally as long as it takes.
And guess what? That grueling hike to the river actually pays off. Using a dead tree branch to hammer away the top layers of snow and crusty ice, they finally deploy the auger. And their scientific gamble is completely validated. The river ice is only about 8 inches thick. The drill punches right through to the churning water below. It is just this massive, frantic rush of energy for the guys. Against all odds, they finally have a fishing hole. But then, hours pass, and the cold just sinks deep into their bones. Jimmy is literally in the middle of this really depressing monologue, admitting he's losing faith, acknowledging that a lack of calories might mean they actually have to call the challenge. And right in the middle of this incredibly dark moment, bam, a bite. The chaos is instant. The line pulls taut, and pure adrenaline just floods the entire crew. So the absolutely agonizing point is right here. Just as they reel the fish to the surface, disaster almost strikes. The fish slips. It catches sideways on the bottom lip of the ice hole, just hovering right on the edge of escaping back into the dark, freezing water. If they lose this fish right now, they lose their only source of food, and very likely the entire 7-day challenge. The agonizing tension in this moment is palpable. You can barely watch. With completely bare, freezing hands, relying on pure, raw instinct, Jimmy just reaches right down into the icy water. Guiding it incredibly carefully, nice and easy, he manages to pull it up through the hole. And the explosive, cathartic screaming that follows, that is the sound of sheer survival. They didn't just catch a fish, they literally caught their ticket to the end of the week.
But let's pause and contextualize this victory with this number, 7. It took 7 grueling, miserable hours of sitting on an exposed, frozen river in the middle of a blizzard to finally secure just 2 fish. It is an absolute testament to the sheer, stubborn endurance required when your back is firmly against the wall and nature gives you absolutely nothing for free.
Let's move on and see how this all builds together, because this victory also highlights an incredible display of teamwork. While the hunters were out freezing for 7 hours, the crew back at camp wasn't just sitting idle. Knowing their friends would return wet and dangerously close to hypothermia, Chandler and Nolan worked tirelessly to build a roaring fire and boil snow into hot drinking water. This survival synergy, perfectly coordinating the camp prep with the hunting, literally saved the returning team from crashing into hypothermia the very second they got back to camp.
It really is a masterful breakdown of teamwork, science, and absolute psychological grit in the face of brutal, unforgiving elements. The anatomy of this extreme survival challenge proves that while Mother Nature is completely relentless, human resilience, with a little help from a roaring fire and a lucky fishing line, can endure almost anything. So, I'll leave you with this to think about. Placed in that freezing snow cave, hungry, wet, and totally exhausted, could you endure all 7 days? Or would you be reaching for that flare gun, fully ready to go home completely bald? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next one.